Hello, I am Pedro Mora, bringing you Pacific Media and now, Pauline. From the World Peace Forum, we present today the closing workshops with 3 speakers. The first one, Mr. Greg Albo, a professor of political economics at York University in Toronto. He questions the neoliberal stimulus packages designed to revive a failing capitalist system. He also warns social democrats and unions about an impending public service cuts, which are planned to continue this year. Here is Greg Albo.
We are in the midst of the deepest economic crisis in 80 years, since the 1930s, in effect. The amount of budgetary deficit the U.S. is going into is about $600 billion, or about 6% of GDP. That means there's a huge debt buildup that's been in response to what was a debt crisis. Now, the critical thing there is the debt crisis is moving, right, from particularly on individuals, consumers, and corporations, right, into the state sector. Okay? So it's moving into the state sector as a fundamental way that the crisis is evolving. This crisis emerges out of neoliberalism. It has aspects, obviously, of being a deeper feature of a crisis of capitalism. But the question of being a more structural crisis of capitalism also means that there has to be social movements, working class movements that are challenging those structures of capitalism. Right? If it isn't at that level, right, you're basically still fighting, in my view, within the structures of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, of course, told us that there should be no deficit financing. And what's occurred in response to the crisis is, again, been a massive turn to deficit financing. And, of course, the coordinated campaign across the G20 to move into deficit financing in the order of 2 to 5% of gross domestic product. The key example of this for us is the U.S. case, which is moving in terms of a deficit financing in the order of $800 billion. And in Canada, it's been the sharp flipping that we saw in like 4 months. Flaherty was Mr. Balanced Budget, and then he was touting the turn to a deficit financing and fiscal stimulus, and then it was a very big fiscal stimulus. So the Canadian deficit now is in the order of $60 billion. Now, it's important when we look at that itself, about what it means. And so when we look at it, you've got to remember that when they have done this fiscal stimulus, right, they maintained a lot of neoliberalism in the actual contents of it. Okay? That is, about 40% of the stimulus is tax cuts, right? And tax cuts that are to be permanent tax cuts, because no government these days says we're engaged with temporary tax cuts and we're going to jack them up in a period. So a lot of that fiscal stimulus, right, is following a tactic that the neoliberals have consistently used, right? Cut taxes whenever you can, and then lock them in as permanent cuts. And going back through the structure of neoliberalism, we know that that's what they have done historically in emergency situations, going back to the early 1980s. You would take advantage of that and cut taxes. I think we need to think about where we are, not only in neoliberalism, but what I would call the great rollback that's coming, or I would fear is coming. I think, and where that puts us, I think you've got to remember that in the 1980s, the development of neoliberalism curbed wages and union power across the 1980s. The 1990s and the first Iraq War and the move towards U.S. unilateralism that occurred after the 1990s led to a development across the 90s of cuts in welfare states and social programs. This week, the IMF last week now, the IMF released a report that laid out the strategy for exit from the fiscal stimulus. They called for 10 years of austerity. Right? This is the same strategy we got 2 weeks before in Canada when the Toronto Dominion Bank released its report on where Canadian fiscal policy should go at both at the provincial and federal levels. This is important because the TD Bank is absolutely close to the main provincial governments and is extremely close to the federal government. They're calling for the same things. New Brunswick has just cut 700 public service jobs. Alberta's gone on, Alberta is now demanding wage rollbacks for teachers and healthcare workers. BC, this is held off until the Olympics, but this will be your post-Olympic celebration. Will be a new attack on the public sector. In Ontario, the budget in the fall economic statement on Ontario laid out its strategy for what they're calling 5 years publicly, but which, if you look at the economic forecast, is also a strategy of 10 years of austerity. Now, what does that mean when we're looking at the public sector now? Well, we know it has difficulty dealing with cutting completely back in health. We know that there's problems on any kind of radical cuts on pensions. This means that if you think about it, 20 years of neoliberalism has cut a lot of back of the rest of the state. This means that the main way you're going to get austerity in the public sector has to be public sector wages and working conditions, which are about 70% of the expenditures in the public sector. And when we think about that, this also means the way that you're going to get those is partly through wage compression that is going to come back through legislative coercive forms of rollback from the state sector. But it also means that they're going to massively experiment in outsourcing and further contracting out of work. The British government has just put forward, and this is the British government under a social democratic government, proposing the outsourcing of 60,000 jobs as an experiment to see outsourcing, I should say, and offshoring, right? 60,000, Britain, right? As just announced it as a proposal. If they have any measure of success, this will spread. And what's occurred in Britain experimenting in this area has always spilled over to Canada. And I think that the difficult parallel that we have to take in account is the way that through the 1930s was rolled in the direction of a harder and harder and more authoritarian state. In my view, we're moving more and more in the direction of the authoritarian phase of neoliberalism. There's going to be a hardening in response to this, particularly because the public sector attacks that are coming are going to be very significant. And when you have those kinds of public sector attacks, which involve services, etc., you can't but deal with it through authoritarian measures. And the ruling class is going to do everything they can to retain their power. In your daughters and your